Hi, I'm Jaime Ross, Assistant Professor in Neuroscience within the College of Pharmacy and the George and Ann Ryan Institute for Neuroscience at the University of Rhode Island. I'm a neuroscientist who's passionate about improving the human condition with a particular focus on aging and age-related diseases, including neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. I found my way to URI via Sweden by way of Boston. But as my son says, it's complicated. I was initially attracted to URI because of the mission of the George and the Ann Ryan Institute for Neuroscience, which is really to identify new paths in underdeveloped areas to maintain brain health. Neuroscience is blossoming here at URI, and I'm so excited to be part of the neuroscience as well as the College of Pharmacy communities. I really got involved in the aging research by accident. When I was starting my PhD studies, my mentors said to me, you can either pick this interesting research that we have going on Parkinson's disease or on aging. And at the time I thought, what does aging have to do with the brain and neuroscience? But once I started working on it, I fell really in love with aging. I really got started in this work because of a tiny, very tiny organelle called the mitochondrion. You may know of mitochondria as being the powerhouses of the cell because they are little energy factories and they're in almost every cell of our body. I was very interested in studying how impaired mitochondria can actually affect aging as well as development. I really would like the community to understand that aging is malleable, which is great news. One of my favorite phrases is leave no stone unturned. And we employ that in the lab by using a multifaceted approach and using a myriad of techniques to answer our scientific question. And this is something that I try to pass on to my students, to have them use this approach of leaving no stone unturned, not only in research, but also in life.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Lapointe, and on behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program. We are happy to present the second discussion in our Fall Faculty Office Hour series, where we're exploring the theme of brain health. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jaime Ross, who is an assistant professor of neuroscience in the George and Ann Ryan Institute for Neuroscience. Serving as today's moderator is Catherine Flynn, Executive Director of the URI Business Engagement Center. If you have questions for Dr. Ross, please post them in the chat section on your screens, and we will do our very best to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. And just a note, this evening's program will be recorded. In a few days, for those who registered for the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, along with recommended resources for further reading. You'll also be receiving a very brief survey from us. We welcome your feedback. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Catherine Flynn.
Thank you so much, Karen, and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be here and so glad all of you could join us. We have a very big crowd tonight, and that's exciting. It must be a topic that everyone is interested in, including me. Today, you're going to meet Dr. Jaime Ross. She's an assistant professor of neuroscience in the George and Ann Ryan Institute for Neuroscience, and assistant professor of biomedical and pharmaceutical sciences in the College of Pharmacy. Dr. Ross attended St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, where she studied neuroscience and the fine arts, an interesting combination, I think. She then obtained her Ph.D. in medical sciences in the Department of Neuroscience at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, Sweden, in collaboration with the National Institute of Health Graduate Partnerships Program. Afterwards, she completed her postdoctoral training at both Karolinska Institutet and Harvard Medical School. So she's way smarter than me. Dr. Ross' overall research interests are to use genetic and genomic approaches to understand the basic mechanisms of disease, focusing on aging and age-related diseases, and in particular, brain aging disorders such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Health, the Rhode Island Foundation, the Fred M. Roddy Foundation, and the Japan Agency for Medical Research and Development. Now, let's hear from Dr. Jaime Ross.
Great, thank you. So it's my pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you about aging and how we can age with a youthful brain. And so what is aging? Well, aging is an evolutionarily conserved process, and it's dedicated not only to our own species, the Homo sapiens. It is, in fact, a process that affects virtually all organisms, from worms to monkeys and mice, as well as our favorite pet, dog or cats. And although the circle of life is conserved across species, there does seem to be a consensus that there's a difference in the time scale, with some organisms living up to 150 years and others only a few years. There's an overall consensus that this seems to correlate more or less with body size. And until a few years ago, aging per se really seemed to be an unavoidable fate. We see in our own species that we have had a remarkable increase in life expectancy. And this is a great achievement. And this is due in major part to advancements in modern medicine, including the introduction of antibiotics, as well as increase in food supply and nutrition. And so this is very nice because now we can live longer and we can spend more time with our children and grandchildren. And for those scientists out there, this means that you can be a Ph.D. student longer at the bench making discoveries, and a postdoc waiting longer for that faculty position to come along. But all jokes aside, this increase in life expectancy is actually projected to continue to increase, so much so that parts of the Western world will have between 20 to 30% of their population older than 65 years. Thus, there is an urgent need to find therapies that can improve our health span and also possibly delay the onset of age-related diseases. And that is because with this larger aging population also comes a higher incidence of age-related diseases, such as heart disease and cancer. And at the forefront of all these age-related diseases is Alzheimer's and dementia, which not only greatly affects the patient, but also the family and society as a whole. So what actually happens to the brain structurally as we age? Well, the first thing that seems to happen is that there's a decrease in brain size. And this is due mostly to a loss of nerve cells. There also is a loss or change in the communication between the nerve cells due to changes in synapses, or those ways that the nerves communicate with each other, as well as dendrites, which look like little branches and trees off of the nerve cells. There's also a change in the chemicals called neurotransmitters that the nerve cells use to communicate to each other. And so this is an image of a 32-year-old brain compared to a 78-year-old brain, just to highlight the fact that you'll see more black areas in the 78-year-old brain, and that's due to a decrease in the brain size, which shows up as gray. And when you think at the functional level, what are the changes in cognition that accompany normal brain aging? Well, most of you probably think about changes in processing speed. We call these fluid processing. We call this fluid processing. And this is true. There's a decrease in your ability to solve new problems, identify patterns, and also think logically. But it's not all bad news. There's actually an advantage to getting older. And that's because you'll have an increase in crystallized processing, which is your knowledge base, your total amount of experiences that help guide you, and skills that you have acquired, as well as an increase in procedural memory, such as how you ride a bike, how you tie your shoes, how you cook, how you play the piano. Because procedural memory is really a type of long-term memory that involves how to perform different actions or skills, as well as an ability to cope with changes in emotions. This does improve also with age. And an interesting study that came out about 10 years ago, or almost 20 years ago now, that still continues to resonate with me is what happens also functionally when you're looking at young people versus older people, and do older people all have the same type of brain aging changes? You may inherently say, well, no, there's different type of aging people out there that have better effects of aging and those who don't age as well. And so what this study aimed to do was they looked at younger participants and they did an fMRI scan to look at areas of brain activity, as you can see highlighted in the red and the yellow. And then they scanned the brains while participants were performing the same task as the younger group. And they asked them, they looked at the brain regions that were activated at that time. And they found that in lower performing age participants, that the same areas lit up when they did the fMRI scan. But there was a group of higher performing age participants, and something amazing was found, and that is that there was recruitment of additional brain areas to actually accomplish the task. So this goes to demonstrate that in some people, as they get older, their brains are able to be plastic and reorganize and recruit other areas of the brain. And so my lab really wants to understand, how does that happen? How can we harness that? And something that also we're really interested in is, why do some people start on the same path of normal aging and then take a right-hand turn and divert into this cognitive impairment group known as MCI, that then can go on to dementia, different forms of dementia? And this impairment can be highlighted here with this clock drawing test, which is one of the gold standards that neurologists use today. And I wanted to include this to highlight that cognitive impairment is not just about your inability to remember something. It's really about an individual's inability to interact with his or her surroundings, such as drawing a clock that's on the wall. You can see that it's really incomprehensible as this cognitive impairment continues to grow. So what are these different types of brain aging disorders that I'm talking about with this cognitive impairment? Well, it seems as though different brain disorders attack different parts of the brain that cause your brain to go from healthy to diseased. And these can be categorized into 4 camps: neurodegenerative diseases that attack primarily neurons, cerebral vascular diseases that attack primarily arteries of the brain, demyelinating diseases that attack the myelin. And what is the myelin? Well, the myelin are the sheaths that insulate the nerve cell axons, or a wire, if you will, so that the electrical signaling can go down the wire and be maintained, as well as infectious diseases. And in these neurodegenerative diseases or brain aging disorders, there seems to be a hallmark of this protein aggregation that accumulates and becomes toxic to the brain, leading to irreversible degeneration of the nerve cells, which then causes the brain tissue loss. You may be most familiar with the A beta plaques in Alzheimer's disease, or the alpha synuclein Lewy bodies in Parkinson's disease. But mostly, there are protein aggregates that occur in all these different brain aging diseases, ranging from Huntington's disease to Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, as well as prion disease. And so thinking of this, we can now separate the brain aging disorders, and you see that Alzheimer's disease and dementia takes up the majority of the diagnoses. 20% or so also are vascular dementia, which make up of arteriosclerosis, stroke, or hemorrhage. Another 7% or so have Lewy body disease, and an example of this is Parkinson's disease. Another 3% have frontal temporal dementia, which is actually divided into 6 subtypes and includes ALS. And there's a lot of crossover between the different types. And there's an additional 1% or so that is made up of Huntington's disease, cortical basal degeneration, for example, which is a rare, progressive, atypical Parkinson's syndrome type of disease that's related to the frontotemporal dementia, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a prion disease, which you may know as mad cow disease. And now when we look at numbers, and this is where it gets a bit daunting, is that every year there's about 450,000 new cases of dementia and Alzheimer's disease in the United States. Right now we have a total of about 5 million Alzheimer's disease cases, and this is about 50 million worldwide, which is about the population of Canada. This is projected to reach about 13.8 million in the United States alone, and 152 million worldwide by 2050. When we look at Parkinson's disease, there's about 1.4 million cases, and ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease is about 30 to 40,000 cases. These are predicted to be about 15 million when you combine all 3 diseases in the US, and will be more than 300 million worldwide by 2100. It takes about an average of 3 caregivers per patient with these diseases. And the total cost for patient care in the United States alone is more than $220 billion per year. And this is projected to increase to more than $1 trillion per year. And it's much more than spent on heart disease and cancer patients, for example. So clearly, there's an urgent need, if you haven't already been convinced, to dedicate research, which we are as a community, to finding treatments for these brain aging disorders. And how do we go about doing this? And what is my lab doing to help solve the case? Well, interestingly, there are different types of people who are successful at aging. And you know these people. They continue to engage in life. They maintain physical and cognitive functioning. They have minimal risk of disease and disability. And we call them successful agers. And so a goal in my lab is to study aging and study these people with successful aging to try to understand what we can harness and learn from them in order to come up with better therapies for brain aging disorders. And that's because we want everyone to live a long, fruitful life with a great health span and only experience about 10% of their life diseased. The nightmare situation would really be to extend lifespan and increase the number of years that we spend in disease. We don't want to do that. We want to extend health span and minimize those years that we are diseased. So the great news in all of this, and if you remember nothing today, remember this: the aging process is malleable. And we've known this since the 1930s, when it was first shown that caloric restriction was able to elongate the lifespan in animals. This was shown again by manipulating different genes with pioneering studies done in IGF-1 receptor. This was done by Cynthia Kenyon's group and others to really demonstrate that the aging process can be manipulated. And so how do we go about this? Well, the aging community has identified several hallmarks of the aging process. And you may know some of these, such as decrease in stem cells, instability of your DNA, changes in your DNA expression, also known as epigenetic alterations, changes in how the cell maintains its proteins and how it recycles them and takes out the trash, if you will, because the cells have to do that. They accumulate a lot of waste and they have to reorganize it, as well as changes in your metabolism as you get older. And so my lab is really interested in several of these hallmarks of the aging process. And we're trying to understand the interconnectedness of them and how they contribute to not just aging itself, but how they contribute to disease onset and progression. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about mitochondria dysfunction or impairment of the mitochondria and how we have used different models of mitochondria impairment to make discoveries of biomarkers to further understand how the aging process can be manipulated, as well as what therapies can be used to improve this hallmark. So what are mitochondria? They are a tiny organelle that lives in your cells, as you can see here in this picture. And when we look in really closely, it has all these different types of structures. And the main job of the mitochondria is to make energy. And they do this through these different complexes called 1 through 5 that live in this membrane within the mitochondria, and they're everywhere throughout the mitochondria. And they produce energy called ATP. You might have learned about that a long time ago. Mitochondria are also important for metabolism of fats, and they regulate different processes such as cell death. And a fun fact, if you didn't already know this, and it's important to understand for the research that we do, is that your mitochondria are actually inherited from your mother, which is unlike your genomic DNA, which you receive a copy from each of your parents. And impaired mitochondria are involved in aging, as I mentioned, but also in several age-related diseases, including cancers, metabolic disorders such as diabetes, arthritis, chronic pain, and several neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, as well as Huntington's disease. So using the fact that we could impair mitochondria to study aging, we've used different mouse models over the years to really try to identify biomarkers. And one biomarker that I discovered when I was actually a Ph.D. student at the Karolinska in Sweden is that when we take the brains and we analyze them using a type of MRI that studies metabolites called proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, that's a big word. We just call it proton MRS. We see that they're in this mouse model where there's actually impaired mitochondria, that they have a very large increase in lactate. And when we look across various ages, we see in the red group that the amount of lactate is indeed about twofold higher and continues to increase as the animals get older. We used other methods to confirm this. Here you can still see that lactate levels are high. And we also found that in normal animals that did not have any genetically manipulated mitochondria, that there's also an increase in their lactate levels, shown here at 86 weeks of age. When we were trying to understand why this may be occurring, we looked more closely at an enzyme called LDH, which stands for lactate dehydrogenase. And this enzyme is really important for controlling the production of lactate. And we found that it's more active in these animals that have mitochondrial dysfunction. And so after this discovery, we really started to argue for the use of lactate and possibly LDH monitoring as a strategy to possibly predict and track the aging process. Fast forward, and there's been several studies that have confirmed this and also translated these findings to humans. In another mouse model, they showed that there, in fact, was increased lactate as mice aged. In humans, they found that when they followed humans from a young age up to well over 100, that there was an increase again in this LDH enzyme activity. Other groups showed that when they genetically manipulated flies and they increased LDH activity, that lifespan actually decreased. And this is shown in the blue group. And conversely, when they decreased LDH activity, the lifespan was extended. So these data together support what we found and also add evidence that different molecules and metabolites could be used as biomarkers to track the aging process. And my hope is that with identification of this biomarker and others, that when you go to your physician for your yearly checkup, you could have this be part of how you track how your brain is doing. We also used these different models with impaired mitochondria to discover that the quality of the mitochondria that you inherit from your mother can actually affect your brain development. And again, this is in animals and has to be further translated into humans. And although you may not be a neuroscientist or neurologist, I'm sure you can appreciate that in the normal brain, there is this layering you see here within this brain region. Whereas in this mouse model where they have dysfunctional mitochondria, this layering is gone. You can also see that in this other region of the brain called the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory, that there's one layer. Whereas in the genetically manipulated model, there's now two layers. And in this example, we found that it has to do with how the nerve cells migrate during development. And we figured that out by using different types of experiments to look at where the cells reside in the control brain and in the genetically manipulated brain. We also went on to show that lifespan is also altered depending upon if you inherit, and this is again in mice, if you inherit healthier mitochondria from your mother. So in mice, if they inherited better quality mitochondria, they lived longer compared to animals that had not as healthy mitochondria. And we did that, in case you're curious, by altering the amount of mitochondrial DNA mutations. We also showed in these same mouse models that onset of aging phenotypes, that is how you present, how you look, how you seem to be aging, can be changed. So in mice that had poor quality of mitochondria, they had more aging signs compared to mice that had healthier mitochondria. And interestingly, when we filtered back in increments, poor mitochondria, you can see that there's a return to these control levels of the aging, the signs of aging. So what does this mean in humans? I told you a lot about different animal models, but what does this mean in humans? Well, interestingly, a paper came out about a year after we published our findings showing that the maternal age of your mother, and this is in humans now, affects the quality of mitochondria that offspring have. And you can see that there's an increase in the number of mtDNA mutations, which affects the quality of your mitochondria. And that this increases as your mother gets older. It's also been shown that older mothers tend to have children that don't live as long. So this is evidence that what we're seeing in animal models can also be translated to humans. But how can we improve our mitochondria and our health span. So again, using these different models of aging with impaired mitochondria, we found that voluntary exercise alone was able to improve the quality of your mitochondria, again, shown by this mtDNA mutation load. So exercising animals had better mitochondria. They had fewer mutations. And exercising animals also had fewer signs of aging compared to the sedentary animals. We also found, when we looked at the protein profile of these animals that exercised, that exercise was able to reset or rescue about 50% of proteins that were being expressed differently due to the impaired mitochondria. So this was really shocking to us, that something simple as exercise could really rescue the mitochondria dysfunction in this animal model. Unfortunately, we didn't see an extension in lifespan in these animals. But this goes back to the overall goal, which is to live a healthier health span, even if we can't extend lifespan. We see this also in humans. There's a plethora of evidence now that really supports exercise to improve health span and to protect against brain aging. And there's a lot of studies going on to understand the intensity and the type of exercise that would be best depending on your age and your health status. But as of now, all movement counts. So if you are gardening, doing housework, walking, dancing, swimming, biking, strength training, running, it doesn't matter. Anything you do counts. And exercise has been shown to slow this cognitive decline, slow the brain loss, boost learning and memory. It also increases your concentration and creativity, which is great. You actually generate more brain cells too with exercise. It improves your mood. It improves your body circulation, which is important not only for the brain, but for other conditions as well. And it has really been shown to actually prevent these brain aging disorders. And, 10,000 steps a day seems like a great goal, but researchers now are really starting to understand and they're starting to question, do we really have to walk 10,000 steps a day? Because for some people, depending on their age group and their health status, that's a lot. And recent studies are showing that fewer steps still have benefits. And so when looking at the literature, I think it's safe to say that an adult, a healthy adult, should aim for at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps a day. And a recent study that just came out, a couple years ago from Harvard showed that about 8,900 seems to be the number that helped to protect against cognitive decline and neurodegeneration in patients who already were demonstrating this cognitive impairment. So what are the factors that seem to modulate aging and disease? And what can we do about it? Well, there are some non-modifiable factors, and that includes your actual chronological age based on your birthday. That's different than your biological age, which is how successful you are at aging. Your biological sex, your genetic risk that you have inherited, and if you had any physical damage or injury. But there are several modifiable factors that I want to talk about. And this is really exciting because the latest number I saw is that more than 30% of dementia cases are attributed to these modifiable factors. More than 30%. And so the first thing that sticks out is really preventative care. You need to work with a physician and make sure you go to those yearly or 6-month visits, however often the physician wants to see you, and track how you're doing. If you have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or diabetes, or depression, you need to keep those under control. You also need to cease smoking and excessive substance use. And yes, that includes caffeine for those of you who are espresso lovers like myself. You need to increase your physical, mental, and social activities. You need to engage in healthy sleep and make sure that you're not having any sort of trouble in the sleep area, such as sleep apnea. You need to have a healthy diet. That's nothing new, but that diet may depend on any sort of genetic risk or condition that you may have. You need to make sure that your vitamins and minerals are balanced. You also need to manage your stress. That one is probably one of the hardest for a lot of people. And also you need to minimize your environmental toxins, such as plastics or other chemicals that could be in your drinking water or in foods, or leaching into your food by containers that you have in your house, things of that sort, or from detergents or soaps. And so to summarize what we talked about, aging really is like a staircase, as depicted here, this Swedish painting from the 1700s called Alderstrappen, or the aging staircase. And, you know, at the beginning, we're very robust and you're going up the staircase. And then the last 40, 50 years or so is when you're really starting to be affected by the aging process. But as I told you, if you remember nothing from today, remember that how you age and if you become a successful ager is malleable. And we will continue to investigate these modifiable factors and how they interconnect with each other and intersect with those different hallmarks of the aging process to identify biomarkers that we can bring to clinic, identify therapies that we can harness and hopefully have some sort of treatment in order to improve the aging process and minimize disease onset and progression. Thank you.
Wow, that was so interesting, Jaime. I guess it was good news, bad news for me. I am good at about exercising, but there's a lot there that I need to fix. So I appreciate you learning all of this. Thank you. So what sparked your interest in the brain and studying brain health? And I do want to remind the audience while we're here that you can type in any questions you might have for Dr. Ross into the chat, and I can ask those individually. But I'm curious, what sparked your interest in the brain? I mean, you could have studied anything. What studying brain health? I'm curious.
I think it really started with my grandmother. When I was a small child, I was really fascinated by the fact that she could not walk very well, but she could move her legs and she could stand up. And I think as a 5, 6-year-old, this really boggled my mind. And since then, I have felt just fascinated by trying to understand the mechanisms behind disease that affect our nervous system. And for a long time, I thought that I wanted to be a physician. But when I was in college, I got involved in some neuroscience research that involved learning and memory. And that was just, that won me over. And I want to understand what happens with the brain as we age. And so that's what did it for me.
Well, that brings me to another question, which is, can you explain a little bit more about the structural changes that take place in the brain as we age and why they occur?
Sure. So the main structural change that occurs in the brain as you age is the shrinkage that we experience. And this seems to be due to the nerve cells degenerating or dying. This cell loss contributes also to thinning of the cortex, which is the outer part of the brain that's really important for receiving and processing information, controlling our movement, as well as where memories are stored. And that myelin sheath that surrounds the wires or the nerve cell axons, they also begin to degrade. And that affects the communication between the neurons in the brain, which then further contributes to that decrease in brain processing that I was talking about. And these changes can be due to a variety of reasons, such as inflammation that we seem to experience with aging, that affects the body as well as the brain, as well as the cell's inability to repair themselves effectively as we get older.
So, what physical effects do we experience with these changes? Like, how do I know what's normal when I walk into a room and I forgot why I went in the room? Is that normal? How do I know? How do I know?
Yeah, that happens to me too, especially being a busy mom.
Makes me feel better.
Yeah, it's okay to occasionally forget where you left your keys or what you were looking for or what you were about to say or the name of the person you met. I mean, I'm terrible at names. I'm great at faces. I think a lot of people are like that. So that's totally fine. As you get older, your brain does go through these changes that can slow down your thinking and your ability to multitask. So something that you could do is just don't take on too many tasks at a time as you get older. And routine memory skills, like we talked about, and knowledge should remain stable and may even improve with age. But those things you talked about there, that's totally normal.
Well, that's good to hear. So if someone today is leading a more sedentary life, is it too late to make lasting changes to their brain health? I mean, do you have to start in your 20s or can you start in your 70s?
Yeah, it's never too late. In a perfect world, and this is why recess is so important and sports are so important for children, that lays the foundation. But it's never too late. You can start anytime. You just have to start moving your body a little at a time. And, one thing, it might be actually great to determine how much you actually move. So a lot of smartphones are great at this, or a pedometer, or, those health trackers like a Fitbit, to actually see how much you move. So then, if you add in extra movement, you may get up to the 7,000, 8,000 steps a day. But that you also need to work with your physician to know, is 7,000, 8,000 steps a day achievable for me, in the condition that I'm in, for example. You need to ask sometimes for professional help. But remember, aging is not lost youth. but a new stage of opportunity and strength.
So a question from the audience is asking about the diet. Are there basic dietary guidelines that you could recommend to improve brain health?
Yeah, I think a place to start with that is you need to understand if you have any underlying risk factors that maybe a certain diet might be better for you, such as, do you have high cholesterol? Do you have high blood pressure? Are you diabetic? Do you have celiac disease, for example? Certainly across the board, a lot of people suggest the Mediterranean diet, which is very high in healthy fats and fiber, a lot of beans and fruits and vegetables. But these are things that you need to discuss with a qualified health professional and possibly work with a dietitian or nutritionist who can help you with your situation. And again, you want to make sure that your vitamins and minerals are also up to date, because a lot of people are deficient in those and they don't actually even know it.
Oh, interesting. So another question from the audience is whether URI provides you with sort of unique partnership opportunities, collaborating partners with your other brain and aging research folks around either Rhode Island or in the greater world. Do you have that opportunity?
Yes. We collaborate with a lot of folks here at URI who, in the College of Pharmacy, for example, who are collecting different sponges from the ocean and trying to understand if they are able to modify inflammation. Also, we're starting to look at environmental toxins and to see how that intersects with aging and disease. And that's something that's really great to do here at URI, given the oceanography institute and the fact that the ocean is right here, so we can actually see what's in the water that may be affecting, the food supply there. And the chemists here on campus are able to make different forms of these toxins that we can test. I'm also still affiliated with the Karolinska Institutet in Sweden. And so we do a lot of collaborating research with them.
That's fantastic. I love the sort of cross-collaborative nature of the work you're talking about, because something like brain health is literally a cross-disciplinary challenge. And so it's what you eat, it's how you move, it's everything. So it's great that you're doing that. Are there other things that I should ask my doctor as it relates to brain health? Or should I ask him to have me draw a clock or whatever it is? I mean, are there things that I should be asking?
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned about your cognitive status, then, perhaps a family member has one of these brain aging disorders, or if you feel or a family member has told you that they're noticing some differences, you should definitely discuss that. And there are some tests that they can do, such as a brain scan, for example, to see what may be going on. There's some other treatments on the horizon, such as this newly approved Alzheimer's disease drug by Biogen that seems to target the aggregated forms of the amyloid beta. But one thing I want to remind everyone is there's a lot of products on the market improving brain health and things like that. But you really want to make sure that you're getting good, solid advice from a trained health professional who has licenses and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hear about all these games you should play, like word games and things like that on your iPad, and even by yourself at home doing things like, is that all true? Like, does that help your brain health?
Yes. So staying cognitively active, puzzles, word searches, that's very important. Reading, learning, challenging your brain is really important. Also, going back to the modifiable factors, making sure that you what was I going to say? Making
Oh,
sure you
I
also,
saw that brain. That brain just forgot something.
that's because it's 7 o'clock at night. Yeah. Just, trying to stay mentally active, physically active, socially active, ward off loneliness, joining clubs. The loneliness aspect can be a major component for older people too. For example, you need to find a good primary doctor who wants to be your partner on your health journey, to really help you take that personalized medicine approach. And you need to know, what are your A1C levels or your fasting glucose? What's your high blood pressure? What's your blood pressure usually? Is it high? Is it low? Um, what's your cholesterol levels? Your thyroid. These are all important things that you need to know about yourself. So you need to make sure that you go to the doctor regularly, especially almost even more so as you get older too.
Great. And the cost of brain disease, when you started reeling off those numbers, I was stunned. And they're just going up because the entire population is aging. So I'm actually surprised there isn't more focus on this challenge. We've got lots of money going to cancer research and heart healthiness and things like that. And yet the brain seems to be left behind, and yet the costs are enormous. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if you have any comment on that. That's just my own observation.
Yeah, the NIH has been really pouring a lot more money into Alzheimer research, in particular, since as you saw, that's the most prevalent of these brain aging disorders. And I think it's devastating not only to the patient, but also it affects families much more so than these other diseases. I mean, heart disease, yes, it's, that's a terrible disease as well, but it's different when you can still interact with that family member or that patient. And in this case, these patients need round the clock care, and they're having a problem interacting with their environment.
Yeah, and that's so hard for the family members and the caregivers,
Yeah.
which is actually the reason the George and Ann Ryan Institute was formed in the first place, because Tom Ryan saw that firsthand as the child of those parents.
Right.
We have one last question about Prevagen and treatments like that as to effectiveness. Is that something that you can comment on?
Again, I would defer people back to a neurologist or their primary care doctor, because there's a lot of over-the-counter treatments. Excuse me. Some of them are fine if it's a typical vitamin or mineral type of supplement. But if you start to get into some of these new type of treatments, it's just my personal opinion that you really need to talk to a licensed healthcare professional who can help guide you. And these are folks who, they look at all the clinical research, not just something that is, let's say, highly advertised or interesting. They're looking at all the research. Has there been a randomized clinical trial?
Right.
And if it's good, they will tell you it's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been so interesting. While you were talking, I looked at my steps, and I'm only at 6,500, so I better go back out and do a couple thousand more steps, it sounds like, so maybe up and down the stairs of my house. But really, this has been so interesting, Dr. Ross, and I really appreciate your contributions to what you do at URI and your contributions as a scientist to the scientific community. And so I think at this point, I am turning it over to maybe I'll just end the season. One thing I would say, our next speaker is actually a member of our music therapy program, which is a brand new program at URI, and Nicole O'Malley will be joining us in the next faculty office hours. This is on the 1st of December, and I will say that doing programs like this keeps your brain active. So come back and enjoy the evening. Thank you.